Welcome to Being Human. I'm Steve Cuss, your host. Great to be with you today. The goal, it's not easy, but the goal is to be human-sized. When we are exactly human-sized, we're carrying what God has asked us to carry, nothing more, nothing less. We're able to connect to ourselves. We know what's going on with us. We're better able to connect to our people, but even difficult people. You know, the people you tend to want to avoid or blame. When you're human-sized, you're better able to connect to them as well. And maybe most powerfully, we're able to connect to awareness of God's presence. I want to be careful there. It's not that we connect to God's presence because God is already connected to us. It's our awareness of God's presence. When we're not human-sized, we go one of two ways. We either get bigger than human, and you can just kind of picture yourself like swelling up, taking up all the space where God resides. So we're like displacing our awareness of God as we get bigger, because we're depending on self to navigate. We've now made ourselves bigger, so we are now what's known as self-righteous. When we go the other way and we get smaller, we tend to move into self-protection. And so, when you get bigger, we move into like pretense or pretending. We're like putting out an image of ourselves that others can see rather than giving them our true self. When we're getting smaller, we've moved into self-protection. You've probably had the experience when you walk into the room and your alarm bells go off and you say to yourself, I can't show up as myself here. I need to just give a little piece of myself. And the reason it's hard to notice God when we're getting smaller is God is no longer our refuge. We are now our own refuge. When we get bigger, God is no longer our righteousness. We are now our righteousness. This show is all about teaching you the signs so you can notice that and then learn how to relax into God's presence so you can be connected and well. I make it sound easy, but that's what we're all about. And I'm fascinated, particularly when my guest is not another white guy like me. I'm fascinated about what it's like when you walk into a room and you're the only one of your kind in a room. Maybe you're the only woman in a room of men. Maybe you're the only African American or minority in a room of white people. What typically happens, this is a generalization, but what typically happens is you're working extra hard to stay human-sized. You tend to be getting bigger, smaller, or you just tend to shrink into one or the other. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to my guest today, Dr. Dennis Edwards. We cover so much ground. Dennis is the dean at North Park University in Chicago, among many other things. But one of the things we get into is what is it like to stay human-sized when you're the only one of your kind in the room? Before we get to Dennis, our candle. So today's question, as you're watching this or listening to this right now, do you find yourself you tend to get bigger, or do you find yourself you tend to get smaller? Another thing you can consider, do you have something on your calendar today that has you anxious? Just a simple idea that you can relax into God's presence as we light the candle. And whatever that is that's going on today, I don't mean to minimize it. It could be a very difficult thing. Simply the memory that God is already there. That as you take that meeting or you walk into that space, God's already beaten you to the punch. He's already in the room. And it doesn't make the situation easier. It just helps you relax into God's presence. All right, here's my chat with Dr. Edwards. So Dennis, you got your start with your bachelor's in chemical engineering, which obviously sets you up well to go into ministry. What happened there?
Well, the short version is I learned that I was not really cut out to be a chemical engineer, but I definitely enjoyed teaching. So I became a science and math teacher. Part of the issue was I wasn't getting a job as a chemical engineer. But I also had more than one, people say to me that God has a call in your life, to consider ministry. It took me about a year to actually believe that. But even after that year, I didn't know what to do. Eventually went to seminary and started to shape into a calling to be a pastor teacher.
Yeah, and you got emphasis in urban ministry, which I'm sure means that Ray Bucky was involved somehow there.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's a great name to bring up. The late Ray Bucky was a big influence in many ways. First, in a literary way, because when I was in my seminary years studying urban ministry with my MDiv. His earliest book, I guess, Urban Christian, was out, and that's back in the 80s, I think 86 and such. I eventually met many more members of his family and got to see him speak and meet him a few times. But yes, he was influential. He helped Christians, I would say mostly evangelicals, to think about what ministry in urban context really looks like. He was really a pioneer that way.
Yeah. And now you're most known for being in the academy. You're there at North Park with your emphasis in your teaching side on the General Epistles, what some might also call the more neglected epistles. Paul gets all the attention.
That's for
Tell
sure.
us what you love about the General Epistles.
Yeah, I think it was John Elliott's, who's done so much work in First Peter. He called First Peter an exegetical stepchild. That term's been used a lot because the General Epistles do get overlooked a lot. In fact, even when I was in seminary, they called them. Some students would affectionately call that class the leftovers because they would spend all this time in the Gospels and Paul. But the professor at the time really did not appreciate that, and I'm glad he didn't. I do find the General Epistles helpful in that they are truly general. We don't really know the audiences, which seems to me much like where we are today, in that there's a Christian message for people, and we don't have to necessarily fixate on where they are. We have to find ways to apply those words in our context, so we don't know as much about the context of some of those letters as we might with Paul's letters. So it kind of forces us to think about how these letters can apply fresh and new in our time, and not necessarily be bogged down with some of the details that we might get pulled into, some of the archaeological stuff and all those things and all the background stuff. Some of that it's wonderful. But even when we don't know it, there's a message for us. And I think the General Epistles help us to see that. And you ask about a favorite. I'm spending most of my time in First Peter. So I guess right now that's my favorite.
Yeah, Peter, even just Peter's own theological journey and growth journey is really something, from the early days of the Gospels to First and Second Peter.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm partial to Jude. Be merciful to those who doubt. That's just that little tag that he has in there.
I appreciate that. I wrote a study for Second Peter and Jude in the Anabaptist Dictionary of the Bible and Anabaptist Bible Dictionary, and I remember that. I mean, Jude gets a lot of hits because he starts out sounding kind of rigid, but there is grace in that letter, and you named it right there.
Yeah. Okay, so most of our audience, I would simply describe them as spiritually hungry Christians on a quest. That people we're wanting more or wanting something, and I know in my life, seminary was profound for that. I'd love to just hear from you, Dennis. Like, this is a tough time to be in higher education, and yet at the same time, we've never needed it more. Why should your average Christian, maybe they're not in vocational ministry, but they just want to grow in their faith, why should they consider taking some seminary?
Yeah, I very much appreciate that question and the way you set it up. The landscape is tough for us. There are challenges. But to answer your question directly, I think some of the things that we get out of seminary, the sense of exploration, being curious, practicing our critical thinking skills, it sets us up to be good stewards of the resources God has given us wherever we end up. So we learn how to do exegesis, and not just on the text, but on our world, on the culture, on our communities. We learn how to be good neighbors, in the sense that that theological education actually helps to shape who we are, not just what we know. So those are things that perhaps can happen outside of seminary, but seminary provides a disciplined space for us to practice those things and practice them in a community of like-minded people who also want those things. So for me, there's it's a rich opportunity to grow in our faith in ways that we might not otherwise.
Well, and that does bring up, your recent book. You did quite a study on humility. I always, humility just opens up so much potential for good paradox jokes. But I do, as I think about that topic in 2024 in an election year, This feels like a timely moment to be talking about humility. How would you see your
Yeah.
study on humility impacting the way we should be behaving as believers?
Yes, thank you. It's funny, when I was working on it, I wasn't thinking so much about the political landscape, primarily, although it was in the back of my mind, of course. But I've gotten most questions about that since the book has come out.
Mm.
And I guess, I mean, because we see how tense it is, right? There's this polarization that we're facing, at least in the United States, and I would argue in other places around the world also. I think humility helps us to be good listeners, first of all. When I learned that the way of Jesus is a way that says, well, Jesus says it. I came to seek and to save lost. He said, I didn't come to be served, but to serve. I mean, if we could learn that kind of posture, that puts us in a place to learn what the concerns are for other people. I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to be this both sides, ride the middle of the road kind of a person. But what I am saying is whatever fears and concerns people are bringing into their political thoughts and actions, that's worth understanding and knowing. And some of those things might need to be corrected. But we can at least start with having a sympathetic ear to know, what are you concerned about? What are you afraid of? And why would you be willing to, maybe compromise on some of your principles to get something else? What's going on there? Humility allows me to ask those questions. What's going on there? And to listen to those answers. But humility also, and this is the thing I try to say in the book, because we have an assumption that humility is always just deferring. No, humility is standing up for those who are weak. It takes much more power to be gentle, to be compassionate, and to advocate for the weak than it does to bully. So humility also includes, in this political climate, making sure that the voices of those that might not get heard do get amplified. So those are concerns that I bring when I talk about humility and the public square, or humility and politics.
Yeah, a lot of your work is about amplifying the voices that what we call so-called from the margins.
Yes.
Um, let's first look at the average follower of Christ who is convinced that they have to correct people based on their Christian convictions that relate to politics. I'm not asking this question very clearly, but I think we've both interacted with somebody who wants to put me in my place or
Yeah,
correct me.
sure.
And I don't think they're feeling self-righteous. I think they genuinely believe that they're trying to help me, but it feels to me like the opposite of humility. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
that makes good sense. I guess I don't have maybe the main best answer, in a sense. I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist. But what I hope for, at least from my pastoral and biblical lens, is that, and it's happened to me many times, that people feel the need to somehow correct me, is I always want them to know that I hear them. And in fact, I had an interaction with a pastor, a couple months ago, and he was pretty animated. And I said a few times, looked him in the face, and I said, I hear you. I said, I want you to make sure, I want you to be sure to know that I hear what you're saying and I appreciate your concerns. I said, I tend to see it this way. And I said, and for these reasons, and I give them. Now, if we come to the end of that and that person's still, really upset, and this person was, there's really not much I can do other than to not sort of match that kind of anxiety and match that kind of, I would even say, intensity of anger. I'm going to be intense in my convictions, but I think my deportment can be such that I show this person that I care about them, and I care about them knowing that they were heard, and I can be respectful to them. But I have no problem disagreeing with somebody and offering my case for why.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me in person. You've got all the dimension of human to human. And then we look at this same issue on like social media. Let's just talk about maybe Facebook and Twitter. I think two of the most inflammatory
Yes.
social medias or social media. I'm not sure
Yeah,
what the
right.
plural is, come to think of
Right.
it. Um, and it's interesting, in my field, one of the things we look for is predictable patterns of behavior. And a
Mm.
predictable pattern is the belief that if I just post my comment, that will change your mind. And oftentimes the posting of the comment is quite smug or full of generalizations. What's going on there? How is there
Oh,
any
that's great.
chance that we
That's a
can
great
stop that?
question. I've been trying to figure out what is going on there. And the experts who seem to write on this will tell us straight out that you're not going to change somebody's mind in that kind of way. And I just won't do it. I mean, I am on those platforms and I find myself probably not getting much engagement because I don't practice those kinds of methods. I mean, I share some things from now and then, from my life, from my studies, from whatever. But I don't really get it. I do think there's something inside of us, though, and maybe this is where the psychologist can help us. Something inside of us where we do feel the need to be validated even by strangers. So if I can put out my stuff there and say something that is provocative and somebody likes it, I mean, I guess they've already proven you get a dopamine rush from that. So there's somehow a sense that I'm getting validated when I do this. But I honestly don't see it coming to much good end. And I actually fear for us when we use, and this us now is the broad human landscape, is that I
Mm.
fear for us that we're getting less skilled at meaningful interactions, and we're getting better at lobbing ideological grenades at people and not engaging in the kind of conversation that could be helpful. And I don't mean to be naive. Not all conversations solve issues, but there are better places to start than just throwing out some provocative comment to get likes from one camp and then to get into an argument with another camp. I honestly don't see how any of that is fruitful.
Yeah, we're definitely in an interesting era where we're almost getting addicted to outrage. I noticed particularly on Twitter, there always needs to be something we're all up in arms about.
Wow.
And I noticed for myself as a white man, I have the privilege of choosing what to be outraged. Like a lot of the broken places in the world, frankly, don't personally affect me. I think the gospel compels me to
Yeah.
be affected by them.
Yeah.
Um, and so I find myself in a difficult territory of figuring out what I should be caring about and what I shouldn't. And then to add to the complication, there's too many broken places.
Mm.
And I always feel like I'm neglecting.
Yeah.
But one of your foci or specialties, Dennis, is marginalization.
Mhm.
I'd
Mhm.
love to get your take on that dynamic.
Well, that's just a rich question also there, Steve, and the way you framed it. That phrase "addicted to outrage," that would be a good title of a book. I think there's something really true about that. But I will say also that anger is an appropriate response to injustice for sure. So I think it's fine to be outraged by injustice. Now, having said that, when I can express my concerns about what I view as an injustice, I then need to really honestly be ready for a conversation or an interaction that either helps to solve that injustice or even somebody to counter my concern. That's fine. Those kinds of discussions, I think, can ultimately be beneficial if we're willing to accept facts and willing to engage in meaningful transactions and sharing data and whatnot. But if it's just a matter of I'm just going to unload my rage and then walk away, that's not helpful in any grand scheme. So for me, I think one of the things that you mentioned even in your question there is that some people do have the privilege of um, not feeling the concerns that other people have who are in oppressive places or have been victims of injustice and can walk away from that or ignore it. Or the thing that bothers me is not so much that they don't see it, it's that they will deny it or and somehow minimize those injustices. That I feel like is a harmful place to be. So what I'm asking for is that people would at least listen to the voices of those who have experienced injustice and marginalization and the pain of oppression and understand that, especially if they're a Christian, that the gospel now compels me to not only pay attention to that, but somehow be an advocate for getting that fixed. And that places a burden on us in some way. Now, that burden, as you suggest in your question, can be overwhelming because there's so many places where injustice. I don't think we're called to fix everything individually. But if I
Yeah.
can join in solidarity with other people who also share like passions, then we'll help to fix some things up before the Lord comes back, at least to show what the kingdom can look like, before the Lord comes back. So I don't expect I don't engage in every issue. And I've had to learn over time how to uh, balance my life into healthy rhythms so I don't get overwhelmed by the kinds of things that could really bring me down or pull me in umpteen directions. But the fact that I am aware, I think, helps me to be a healthier person and a more globally minded person.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's a really helpful way to navigate it.
Thank you.
Earlier this year, my wife and I were teaching a marriage conference. My wife's a trauma therapist, and so we teach people what we call the least cool, most helpful marriage conference, where we actually teach about trauma in marriage, and not very romantic, but really helpful.
Yeah, it's helpful for sure.
Yeah. But anyway, at one point, the conference organizers had told us in the planning, they said, we always like to do a session where, Steve, you will be with all the women. Lisa, you will be with all the men. And so I found myself the only man in a room of 500 women. And it's always interesting, Dennis, when you're the only one of your kind in a room. And I say that as a white man, like I tend to be in majority space most of the time. You must have had to navigate this in your life.
Oh, my
What is
goodness.
it like when you walk into the room as the only black man?
Yeah, that I'm getting up there in age. I'm at the tail end of the baby boom, so I've been around for a while. And just to put it in quick context, I grew up in New York City. That's my home, really. And as someone from from New York, who grown up in my era, it wasn't all that long after schools were trying to desegregate. So I was bussed into a white neighborhood for school, and there were many years that I was the only black kid in my class, or the only black boy, and maybe there was a black girl in class. And then that continued into my adulthood, going into spaces where there just weren't very many black people. I'm chuckling because some of those times it's kind of funny. Other times it's really frustrating, and it's tiring, and it's even painful at times. And I think what I've done over the years is I've been more selective about the spaces that I will enter into if I have a choice. But the way you frame your question, if you go into the room and find that you're the only one, I think my temperament has been such that I used to shrink. I used to pull back because I didn't want to take um, any more hits. So if I speak up and people don't like it, then they're all going to turn all on me, and that has happened. And I didn't have an advocate in the room. I didn't have somebody else who. So I become much more vigilant, and I would say even careful about what I say in those groups. It's not because I'm afraid to speak the truth. Well, maybe it is. Maybe I'm afraid to speak the truth and take all the hits on my own. And if I'm honest about it, I don't want to have to be put on the defensive in a room full of people who have power and have societal clout. It's not a fun place to be at all. So I will do the best I can, but I mean, in all honesty, Steve, I'm at a place in my life where I try to avoid that. It's hard. Now, if you're that man in that room of women, I think in that dynamic, that's interesting to me because men have a privileged place. So I would find myself saying, "Oh, I want to listen to the concerns of these women." But when you're the minority in that majority space, it's like I've been listening all my life, and certainly would want them to listen. But my concern has been they listen, don't like something I said, and then turn on me, and then I have, like I said, no advocate, no place to go, and that's a very painful place. So I don't volunteer to go into those painful places much anymore in my life. I did when I was in my 20s and 30s, and actually even into my 40s, but I don't do it anymore.
Yeah, I really appreciate the distinction you made, because like if you are a person born into privilege and power, it is not like for like, me being in a room of women, or sometimes, Dennis, like my teenage daughter will come home for lunch and bring all her Swiftie friends, and it's me and a bunch of teenage girls. And it's more the idea of, man, I'm so self-conscious.
Yes.
But then when you put, the extra layer of, for example, a minority culture, or for example, like a black woman in a room where there's multiple layers, a black woman walks into a room with all white men. I love what you just said, because our studies have shown in the field I teach in, it takes so much more energy to be exactly yourself
Yes.
than
Yeah.
if you have a company of sisters and brothers with you.
Oh, wow. So well said. Takes energy to be yourself. I would say, that scenario you painted, there's those who write on these topics talk about, this intersectionality, this kind of sense that our different selves, I guess, different aspects of ourselves, our race, gender, those things, how they come into play in these spaces. And again, it's not an area of expertise for me, but it's good that we can actually talk about that and notice it, because I find myself sensitive to women coming into spaces, Christian spaces particularly, that have been dominated by men. So I feel like, well, as a man, I have relative privilege there. So I want to make sure that that person's voice gets heard. Oftentimes it can be a younger person or a much older person. They get marginalized. Our elders get marginalized. Young people get. So for me, I feel like this call on my life is to make sure that they get heard and don't get ignored in those spaces. But I haven't always felt like how I get my voice in those places. And so you hit on something that's actually a sensitive area for me, because it's been a struggle for much of my life. Excuse me. A struggle for much of my life, because I haven't always been able to find my voice in those places. So like I said, I've tended to shrink away or just not go.
Yeah. Yeah. My field being reactivity, I teach people how to notice reactivity. And the two simple signs are when we get bigger than human sized or smaller than human sized. And you've used the phrase a number of times, I shrink down. And as I'm hearing you, Dennis, I hear this a lot from people where they say, oh, I didn't speak my mind. And then they'll go into some kind of shame, when in reality, the system is designed to shrink you down. But just by definition that no one else is in the room with you, you can't win. If
Yeah.
you're in a room of 12 people, you're the only black man.
Yeah.
It's a losing game.
Right.
As opposed to if there were 3 or 4 other black men and women in the room, that would actually open up for the white people to have a better chance to hear what you have to say. So
That's
it's
it.
not even just an individual thing. It is, in fact, a systemic
Yeah.
challenge for all of us.
I appreciate you saying that. You've named situations that have been true in my life and in my experiences. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So as we're digging into my field, one of the things we're doing at this part of the podcast is talking about false needs. Anxiety is fascinating because there's several anxieties that are based on something true, like if you ever see a poisonous snake when you're out for a walk, or if you lose a child in a playground. Those are actual real threats.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of anxiety called a chronic anxiety. That's the one we specialize in. It's always based on a false need that feels real in the moment. And
Mm.
a classic one for me would be people pleasing. Like my body tells me I must make you happy, even though it's not a real need.
Right.
I can
Right.
actually disappoint you, make you mad, and I can thrive as a human. Another one for me, Dennis, would be it's very hard for me in a meeting to say I don't know.
Yeah.
If somebody asks a question, I feel like the world needs me to have an answer.
I, I, I,
Um,
I hear
what
that.
does that bring up for you? What false
Uh,
needs would you say you might have?
well, interesting. That second one, I don't have that problem. I'm very comfortable saying I don't know. But that first one, the people pleasing, that has been a problem for me. I think, the way I grew up in the context I've been in, as I mentioned to before, being the only black person, there are times I felt that I somehow had to make sure that people weren't going to be upset with me. So I tended to be very guarded with my actions, or in that phrase we've used before, kind of shrink down, some way to not appear to rock the boat. And I've had difficulties in places in ministry too, even as I've gotten older, where, and it's been more in context where I've come to serve or work in a church that had a culture and all, and I'm trying to learn that culture. And some of the others in the church have expectations of me that I'm going to be just like them and know the culture, and I don't. And as I'm trying to learn, I'm not assertive. I'm trying to learn, but they expect something out of me, and there's a sense of me feeling like I'm always falling short. I'm not meeting their expectations because I'm somehow not giving them what they want. but they haven't made clear to me what it is that they want, So, so it's been that was very hard for me. And I'll say something else, Steve. This is just a quick glimpse into my background. I mean, coming out of a church, a little storefront church when I was in New York, growing up, there were older people who really had a posture of deep spirituality. At least that's the way they would come off. But they tended to be very self-righteous people. I mean, we use the term holiness a lot in the church that I grew up in. So these holy people who would come off almost like they had no flaws, but they could be mean, they could be indifferent to genuine concerns that people had because they were so holy. That there are people who sort of fit that image for me when I've gone into other spaces who come off as that holy, self-righteous person that when I was a kid, I did not want to disappoint. I did not want them to look at me as, this horrible sinner. So I tended to either avoid them or defer to them, and somehow found myself not being my true self around people who projected this aura of spirituality. It took me a while to learn I was doing that.
Yeah. And as you started to notice that pattern, this is where it gets fun, I think. What did you find to be helpful to manage that so you could more? I don't think we ever always show up as our true self, but we can certainly grow in that.
Part of it was, I did get therapy and talk to different spiritual directors over time. I think on a very basic level, it was to not project onto those folks assumptions that I had made of them judging me. And then to even say, even if they were judging me, there's still a lot of the Dennis, that they don't know. So they can't really be making a genuine assessment of me. They don't know me. And I can't assume that they are disappointed with me or, I mean, sometimes they are disappointed me. Sometimes I did have the evidence that they were disappointed me. But most of those interactions I came to think of as there's a lack of knowledge here, and I'm assuming some things about them that might not be true, and they're assuming some things about me that might not be true. And that kind of freed me up to say there's nobody knows the whole story here. So I'm not going to worry so much about what they assume Dennis to be like. And then also to balance that out, there are a whole bunch of other people who are really quite happy with Dennis and like the way I interact with them. So for this subset of people to have an issue with me or appear to have an issue with me is not fair to the whole picture. I'm only seeing a little piece of something. So those things sort of helped me to think about it.
You've given us a real gift here because you've used some language that's actually technical in systems
Oh,
theory, which is assumption and expectation.
oh my
This is
goodness.
really, really helpful. Is chronic anxiety is always generated by a false assumption that we have inside of us that we put on others, and it's also generated by expectations that people place on us that we cannot or will not live up to.
Wow.
Thus, that's the only kind of anxiety that's contagious. Is one of the things that's fascinating about it is it spreads in groups. But
Wow.
yeah, even just telling that story, you gave us those words that I think my listeners can really pay attention to. Is what assumptions am I holding that have a hold of me, that keep me bound, and what expectations is someone portraying that I'm not willing to do.
I appreciate you saying all of that, Steve, because that's actually still very freeing for me to hear that. Because when you're going through those things, you're thinking you're the only one, or
You're crazy,
somehow
yeah.
this is unique about me. So to
Yeah.
hear that there's that you and others study this kind of thing is helpful for me to hear. Yeah, I mean, it is freeing, and I can always use those words at any time in my life to help me feel free. I always need that
Yeah.
shot in the arm. I grew
Oh,
up in a
it's
church
so
that,
good.
yeah, well, the church didn't always see God as love, even though we would say those words. We really saw God as a judge who was looking for us to mess up and just waiting for us to mess up. That was my view of God. So I was so careful that I even held it in my body in the way I walked. And I mean, I played football my freshman year of college, I remember, and I saw a varsity player passing me one day, going between classes. And he said, "Hey, Dennis." I said, "Hey." And he said, "Dennis, you walk like a robot," he said. And he kind of was joking and walked past me. But I realized I was stiff. I in my own body, I was careful. I was so careful around people. And always feeling I was being judged and such. But that's how my view of God was too. So it's taken me a while to see God differently. So often when I start my prayers, I will start out just thanking God for loving me, because that was hard for me to feel when I was younger. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank God for the General Epistle of John,
Yeah,
1 John
amen.
3, 19 and 20. I think, all of 1 John is just such a beautiful reminder. But for me, 1 John 3, 19 and 20, this is how we know that we belong to the truth, and how we set our hearts at rest in God's presence. Even when our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our hearts.
Yeah,
That's an
amen.
amazing,
It is beautiful. It's beautiful.
oh,
I'm actually slowly working on a commentary on 1, 2, 3 John. So I'm really appreciating that you say this. That's wonderful.
I'll be looking forward to that.
Thank you.
Well, Dennis, our audience is kicking around the 5 core false needs that every human, and not every human has all 5, but we've already covered the 5th one, which is people pleasing.
Mm.
I just want to check briefly and see if you relate to any of the other 4.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is control, people who need to be in control. Second one's perfectionism. Third one is knowing the answer. That's one of mine.
Mm-hmm.
The 4th one is the incessant need to be needed. You can't tell the difference between someone's need and your need to be needed. So it's control,
Yeah.
perfection, having the answer, being there for others, and approval. Do any of the others of those?
Yeah, I definitely appreciate it. The perfectionism. That's definitely been me, and that I never like to make a mistake, and didn't want to be seen as careless in any way. So. Yeah, I'm laughing because I think about projects that I worked on that I really, really just wanted to get it right. Didn't want to. But for some people, that perfectionism causes them to procrastinate. I'm not a procrastinator, and that kind of gets at the other one, which is the to be needed kind of a thing. I I very much like to be needed, and I saw some things in my father that I admired. I actually tell some stories in the humility book where he had a real gift to service, and he would help people at church. He'd give them rides home, and help out at church and things. And I admired that, so I also like to do that. But there are times when I know for sure that I have made life more difficult for myself by extending myself in spaces I really did not need to, but yeah, it seemed to be satisfying something inside of me to say, I can solve this problem for you, or I can help you out here. And I even still find myself, if I'm even walking past people I don't know, if they're lost or sounds like they're lost, I'm just ready to step in there, see if I can help you out. And I'm not saying that's bad, but you get to diminishing returns, right? You get to a certain point where it turns from being helpful to being harmful. And I definitely can relate to that one.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Well, just to turn the corner on that, and then I'm sorry, we've run out of time. We're going to have to do the gauntlet. I know you've been fearing it. I can feel it from you. The terror and anticipation of the gauntlet, it's coming. But
Okay.
One of the things we do in our work is help people remember that the big 5 is actually God's core attributes. God is in control. He's sovereign. God is perfect. We get to make mistakes and learn and grow and so on. And that's one of the ways that we teach people to relax into God's presence. I don't say that to you, Dennis, as much as just to remind our audience that
I receive it, though. I receive it. It's great.
Yeah, and me too. It's something I need all the time. But let's just take a quick stock of the situation here. You have pastored in 3 of America's iconic cities. You have probably memorized the periodic table. You have opened the Greek of First Peter, and yet you have not successfully navigated the being human gauntlet of anxiety. So without further delay, I've got, I think, 5 or 6 questions for you here. This tends to be more rapid fire. We'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Question number 1, what types of people trigger you the most?
It's related to what I was talking about earlier. It's people who come off as if they know everything, and they appear like used car salesmen to me, and that they try extra hard to charm when I don't need to be charmed. I just need information. So those people who have that charm persona drives me nuts.
Do you have a hostile relationship with telemarketers?
That would be one iconic example of what I'm getting at.
I've become in this weird situation. You know how sometimes a robot calls you, but they sound like a human? Like that's getting quite sophisticated, and so they'll ask you questions in the algorithm, and I need to prove to the robot that I know it's a robot.
Ah.
And I'll usually, when it's a telemarketing robot, I'll usually say, hey, before we go on, what's your favorite color? Because I know that the algorithm didn't, and then it confuses the robot. And I say, I know you're a robot. And I hang up. And then my beloved wife just looks at me like, what? Why are you doing that?
Well, you're more clever than I. I'm from New York and I just don't have patience. So I just hang up.
I don't think my wife would say it's clever. I think she would say it's a sickness. Okay, tell us where you've seen anxiety spread in a group. We don't need names, but as a general rule, who was spreading it and who was carrying it?
Yeah, I recall different contexts I've been in, and it's almost all of them have been in church contexts where somebody has a particular fear, but also has a certain prominence in the group. So when they articulated their fear, I saw, oh my goodness, most of the people in that room become anxious and fearful, seeming like catching it from that person. And this one particular meeting I'm thinking of, this church group actually even made a vote that I thought was just a horrible kind of a thing to do, to vote and keep certain people out of the church. And it was born clearly out of the fears that people had. And this one person seemed to trigger that for everybody in the room.
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes the most anxious person in the room has the most power. That's a
Yes.
haunting story.
Yeah. And I've seen that play over it with, different kinds of consequences. But the way you just said that, the most anxious person has the most power. And I've seen that. Yeah.
Okay. This will feel like a bit of a gear change without a clutch. Thus is the nature of the gauntlet. But tell us about the first time you ever saw a dead body.
Yeah. Yeah. It was actually my older brother. I had two, I have three older brothers and three younger sisters. And one of my older brothers, the first two are much older than the next five of us. And one of those was shot and killed in the Bronx in New York. And it was the first funeral I went to. And for some reason, I could not get out of my seat to get close to the body. When people walk around for that last time to view the body before they close the casket. And I still remember the adults around trying to get me to do it. And my grandmother at one point saying, don't force him. So I could see the body from where I was, kind of from my seat, but I didn't want to go up real close to it. And it's funny because as a minister, you do a lot of funerals, and every single funeral I have done, I think about that day,
How old were you then, Dennis?
I was 11. I was 11.
How old was your brother when he died?
He was 19.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a poignant story. Okay, let's talk about your family of origin. What might be one asset and one liability that you've inherited from your family of origin?
Yeah. My little sister said this at my father's funeral. I actually officiated my father's funeral. My mother died young. She was just 52. So I was 20 years old when she died. And at the funeral of my father, my youngest sister said, "Mommy taught us to be strong. Daddy taught us how to love," she said. And and it still sticks with me. And that was 20 something years ago. And I thought, I think she's right. Is that compassion I mentioned about my father earlier, able to serve and help people in need? I feel like that's something I learned from him. My mother, very firm, very stalwart, and I would say, even though I've been hurt at times, I've been pretty tenacious. Like I don't give up easily, and I think I learned that from her. And I don't see it as a stubbornness; I see it as a tenacity.
Okay. Two more questions to go. When the local church is at its best, what is something that you can get from the local church that you can't get anywhere else?
It's meaningful relationships with people who that you might not otherwise know. I mean, maybe that's too simple, but I have been in churches like that, and I've seen people from, making a lot of money in these really high powered places, doing well, stable family, working with people who are, barely getting by in public housing and stuff, and developing a genuine friendship. I mean, having meals at each other's houses and coming from totally different worlds. That's something I didn't see in many churches. And it was in a church I planted in DC. And I remember thinking how, I don't know how this would happen anywhere else. And so I think when the church at its best, it facilitates that kind of Christian connection and even unity, I would say.
Hmm. Okay, thank you. And final question, when in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
Yeah. I it's when I'm with my family. I have and so we have 5 grandsons. They're little. But when we get together and do like a cousin camp so that they all can come together and be with their cousins and play and stuff, they hang on me, and I love that. I mean, they want to be around me. They want to hear me read the stories to them. That's something I never imagined when I was a younger guy, and I thought, grandfather, just an old person. And okay, yeah, I am old, but I'm loving this part of it. I feel
Mm.
loved.
Mm. My guest is Dr. Dennis Edwards. He's the dean at North Park University Seminary. He's the author of multiple books. His most recent one came out just about a year ago, Humility Illuminated, The Biblical Path Back to Christian Character. We'll have a link to his website, the wonderful website, the revdrdre.com.
That's right.
Where you can learn more about Dennis. Definitely a needed voice in 2024. Dennis, thanks so much for joining me on Being Human.
Thank you, Steve. This was really a pleasure. Appreciate it.